Another thing you could do, if you can't find a washer and the distance is so slight, what you can do is actually in the area that's not touching the table, you can stack up transfer sheets, one on top of each other, in the section on top of the table, and that'll lift the silicone up higher instead of lifting the metal table up with washers, especially if the distance is so slight. You can actually stack transfer sheets, sticky side on top of one, on top of another, till you make up the distance, and just put it underneath the silicone, and then put this down, and then boom, you'll shim up the silicone table to the gun nozzle.
So why is my machine placing the stones on their sides?
Stones placing on the side, there's several possibilities that can cause this. Number one, does your design that you created, how much gap are you allowing between stones, okay? For instance, these glass cut stones actually are not consistent in diameter. If I were to put a caliper on these stones, you will find, like on an SS6, which should be 2 millimeter, or actually a majority of those stones will be 1.90 to 1.97 of a millimeter, okay? Some of them, a smaller grouping, will actually be 1.80 to 1.9, and there'll be even a smaller amount of stones that are between 1.7 and 1.8, okay? Rarely will you find a stone that's below 1.7. Now, because we're using glass cut, and the way they make the stone, it's hard to actually make a design with stones right next to each other, right on top of each other, because of the distance, the difference in diameter from stone to stone. What'll happen is you'll set your alignment to pick up the stone correctly, and then as it lays the stones out, those stones that are changing vastly will actually contact that previously set stone, flipping it up on the side. Okay, so that's one thing you want to make sure. Another thing you can actually do is to see if your alignment's out. Alignment is the first thing. In other words, this hopper and this parts feeder plate have to be adjusted so when this gun picks up the stone, it's dead on the stone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into system, I'm going to go to magazine, and I'm going to choose the left side. I'm going to go to parts feeder, spin it, make sure you have a stone in there, and then I'll bring my gun over, and with the air turned off in the back, I can bring this gun down. You want to make sure that your alignment is dead center. Okay, you can see that when I bring that gun down to that stone, it's going to rest centered on that stone. If I was out left or right of the stone, then it's going to pick up the stone on the left-hand side of the nozzle tip or right-hand side. And when that happens, when it gets placed on the transfer sheet, it will hit the previously set stone, especially if I have no gap between stones. So that's the first thing I check for is my alignment, to make sure my alignment is true. The next thing I want to do, let's say it's only placing my smaller SS6 stones on their side, but the SS10 stones run fine right throughout the whole design. The difference would be the height of the stone. Obviously, an SS10 stone has a little bit more height than an SS6 stone. So the things I'm going to want to check for is actually the height or the depth of how far this gun comes down into the hopper. So what you want to do is you want to go to in your system menu, you want to go to magazine part, and then choose the side where your SS6 stones are. Mine happens to be on the left. And then bring the gun over and down. And then look at the distance between the nozzle tip and the plate. If there's a greater distance between the two, then like if the nozzle tip is too high away from the plate, then what's happening is when the gun comes down to grab the stone, it's not actually grabbing it. It's allowing vacuum to lift the stone off the plate, which could sit on its side. All right. Once it's captured on the nozzle tip on its side, it's going to transfer to the transfer sheet the same way and be placed on its side. So review our video for stones dropping off the gun nozzle, for how to adjust this gun, the height of the gun rod. Also, too, on our website, we do have a PDF file that shows you how to adjust your gun depth to the plate. Okay. So on this one here, you can see my distance off the plate is perfect. Okay, so that's not the problem. But my stones keep laying on their side. Obviously, the first thing you want to do, let's say I started the design, it's laying fine. All my SS6 stones or SS10 stones are laying fine. As it progresses through the design for some reason, all the other stones that towards the end of the design are on their side. What you want to do is check to make sure that nothing happened, your air compressor did not trip a breaker. To do that, it's simple. If you come around to the back side of the machine, we have a regulator right on the back, and you want to see that it's on 6. Now, if it's below 6, then you want to check your air compressor. Something happened to your air compressor, it kicked off. It's not repriming it. And you've exhausted all the stored air or getting close to it. The minute this gets closer to the 0.4 number, the less hold of a vacuum I have on the stone, and the stone is going to drop prematurely off the gun nozzle as the gun is moving down towards the transfer sheet. So it just places the stones on their side. All right, we'll come back to the front of the machine. The other possibility that can cause this is that when this gun receives the stone, rotates around, when the gun comes down to place the stone on the transfer sheet, the distance between the surface of the transfer and the gun nozzle's full extension is too distant. What we want to do is test for that. What you want to do is you want to go into the system menu and go over to this option X and Y. Now you can see X and Y has a spin option to it. So go down to it, press set. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the right arrow button. That's going to spin the gun around and down. And I'll hit the down arrow button. And what I'll do is I can see that my nozzle tip is touching the table. And move your table all the way around, making sure that it's touching at all locations. If it's too far away, like this, well then of course, when the gun is extending down to place the transfer sheet, it's not actually touching your transfer sheet, so it drops the stone, which is going to be heads up or tails up or sideways up. So what you want to do, if that's your case, then possibly what happens is when the design is finished and you're putting your white backing on your transfer sheet, you're pressing too hard on the table and you're taking it out of balance. Now, one thing you can do to actually correct that is simply find out what the distance is you got to make up, okay? Let's say on the bottom right-hand side, all my stones are placed over here are placing upside down or sideways, but in all other areas, it's fine. And if I go and test, and I can see, well, I'm touching the table in all locations, but over here, like from here to here, there's a distance. So what I got to do is I got to shim this table up closer. All right, so to do that, you simply pull this cover off, and you see we have 8 screws here, 8 Phillips screws, okay, and this table will come off. What we want to do is you got to be precise in how much distance you have. Use a stack of papers, stack them up, and find out what the distance is between the nozzle tip and the surface of the transfer, and go to a hardware store and go get a washer that matches that distance. Take off these screws, these 8 screws, and what you want to do is put a washer underneath the table where these screws are, and that'll lift this table up a little bit more. Another problem that can cause the gun nozzle not to touch the table, if you come down close, is if my tubing here is cut too short, what'll happen, it'll tug on the gun. Watch, I will simulate it by pulling. You see how it's not touching the table? And that's because when the gun rotated from here to here, the length of tubing is actually pulling this fitting, and it's getting bound up on its dissension. The way to test for that is simply just disconnect this tube, bring the gun down. Is it touching the table now with the tube disconnected? If it is, then you know that you need to cut a slightly longer piece of tubing here. You do have 10 or 15 feet of this soft tubing. Just take this tubing off both sides, cut yourself a new length, put it in there, and test it. This is the #1 reason why the gun nozzle will not touch the table, is that they provided maintenance to the tubing and they cut the one too short, and now it's tugging at this fitting.